In Job chapter 1, we understand that Satan and the Lord began to talk about Job. And Satan says, well, the reason why he serves you is because you bless him so much. And so he requests permission to affect Job's life, and God grants him that permission. And so in the first chapter of Job, Job loses a great deal of livestock. He loses his servants. He loses his children. That's a grief. That's a grief that I can't even imagine. To lose one child must be difficult enough, but to lose all your children in one swoop, on top of all the other things, there's a tremendous amount of grief there. And still, Job does not curse the Lord, and so Satan returns and says, let me touch his body. You've put a hedge around him. Let me touch his body. And so God gives him permission, gives Satan permission to touch his body as a way of testing Job. And so he breaks out with sores all over his body. And by this time, verse 9 comes along, and you would think that his wife would be a comfort to him, as she has suffered as well. Job's wife suffers with him. You'd think that she would be a comfort to him, and in chapter 2 and verse 9, Job's wife says, do you still hold to your integrity? Curse God and die. But Job doesn't. He is grieving. He is in a tremendous amount of sorrow and darkness. And during this period of time, he has some friends, some comforters come to be with him. And so his friends come and they sit beside him, and for a few days they don't say anything. They just sit beside their grieving friend. And at the end of that period of time, they began to talk. And when his friends, his comforters, began to talk, they began to tell him that the reason why all this happened is his fault. That he has done something against the Lord, and that's why all this stuff has happened. It's because Job has brought it upon himself. And Job knew that wasn't the case, that he had been faithful to the Lord. And in Job chapter 12, Job says something that last year during camp became our theme passage. Job says, but now ask the beasts, and they will teach you, and the birds of the air, and they will tell you, or speak to the earth, and it will teach you. And the fish of the sea will explain to you, who among all these does not know that the hand of the Lord has done this, and whose hands is the life of every living thing and the breadth of all mankind. You know what Job is suggesting? Job is suggesting that there are lessons to be learned from the beast that God has created. That there are lessons to be learned from the birds that God has created, that they will tell us. That the earth itself will teach us. And that the fish of the sea will explain to us the fact that there is a God who is the source of all life. You know what one of the things that Job does while he's grieving? He sits outside. And I believe that in his mind, surrounded by God's creation, he is reaffirming his faith. Reaffirming it. And notice what it says at the end, in that, who among all these does not know? Who among all what? All God's creations, the beasts, the fish, the birds, the earth. Who among all these does not know that the hand of the Lord has done these things, and that It's His hand that gives life to every living thing and the breath of all mankind. Do you remember what Psalm 19 says in the first few verses? In Psalm 19, beginning in verse 1, David writes in this psalm, "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament shows His handiwork. Day unto day utters speech, and night unto night reveals knowledge. There is no speech nor language where their voice is not heard. Their line has gone out through all the earth, and their words to the end of the world. In them He has set a tabernacle for the sun." You want something to affirm that there is a God? Go outside. Go outside. And if you listen to it, God's creation, the earth and the critters that are out there, they have something to say. They declare the glory of God. They prove that there is a God. The beauty of God's creation. We felt like this was a great camp topics, and seeing how we as a congregation were going to our first week at camp out at Big Reedy, where there are all kinds of critters out there. And so this was our theme. And I want to point out to you just some of the ways that God reveals Himself in creation. Look over, if you will, in Proverbs chapter 30. Proverbs chapter 30. The writer here says that you can look at the creatures of this earth that God has created and find in them wisdom. You can find in them wisdom. And in this particular passage that we're going to read, which is Proverbs chapter 30, beginning in verse 24. Notice what it says. "There are 4 things which are little on the earth, but they are exceedingly wise. The ants are a people not strong, yet they prepare their food in the summer." I mentioned this a couple of Wednesday nights ago, that ants are remarkable creatures, and there are life lessons that we can learn from ants. One of those is that they're smart enough to lay by in store for when the tough times come. You know who else talks about that? Dave Ramsey. A person talks about that in his financial planning. He says you ought to have an emergency fund for about 6 months in case Murphy's Law happens in your life. That wisdom is evident in the ants. And let me just ask you this. I'm curious about this, and this is the question that's going to override the whole night. How do ants know? How do ants know that they're going to need food later and they're not going to have it available to them if they go outside to get it? How do they know that? Could it be that God pre-programmed them? Pre-programmed them so that they could be a wisdom teaching for us? Notice what it says, keeping on going here. It says, verse 26, "The rock badgers are a feeble folk, yet they make their homes in the crags." I was up at the Louisville Zoo a few weeks ago, and right next to the giraffe display, there is a rock badger up there. It's called a rock hyrax is another name for it. And they look just like this picture right here. You know what that is out in the wild, that thing right there? That is a chicken nugget. It has no solid way of defending itself. It doesn't have some big claws. It's not going to outrun anything for sure, but it has enough smarts to hide itself in the crags of the rocks so that the predators cannot get to it. Doesn't that sound like a New Testament teaching? That we are to build upon the rock and hide ourselves in the cleft of the rock, which is God. wisdom in God's creatures. Let's keep going. Verse 27, the locusts have no king, and they all advance in ranks. You know, the locust is an interesting creature. It is an independent creature until it needs something particular, and when it needs something in particular, it joins forces with a bunch of folks, other locusts, to become a swarm. And in the swarm, they're able to do things that they can't do individually. They organize and accomplish great things. Is there not wisdom in that? That sometimes we need the strength of other people to accomplish certain things? I believe so. That's why the Lord, I believe, gave us the church, is that we did not have to go about this by ourselves. But it's not done. What is the fourth creature that is mentioned here? Verse 28, the spider skillfully grasps with its hands, and it is in kings' palaces. Now, I'm reading from the New King James Version. You may have a different version. Instead of spider, it may say lizard. Okay? Either way, whether it's talking about the lizard or the spider, I'm not really completely sure, but the message is the same. Is that this creature, the spider or the lizard, it's small, it's tiny, and it uses what ability it has to make its home in the most beautiful of places, the king's palaces. You know, one in particular, but a few people in my family love Disney World. Love it. They enjoy going to Disney World, couldn't go enough. If you decided they were going to Disney every week, they could go every week. I've been there a few times myself, and as you walk through Cinderella's castle there, which is the place, right? If you look closely enough, up in the corner, there's a spider living in Cinderella's castle. What is the biblical message in that? Well, there may be several, but one of the big ones is that we ought to use what talents we have to the best of our ability. We might be surprised where it takes us if we use the talents that God has given us. You see, throughout all of creation, we are, if we look and we see it the right way, we see that this world, that God has created in such a way to encourage us and to teach us and to affirm that He is. Let's shift gears. Let me give you a tough one. Well, Chris, I see what you're talking about with the locust and the ant and the rock badger and the spider. But what about these critters? For those of you whose vision may not be especially good, I had someone tell me that this morning. They said, I couldn't see your picture of the crucifixion very well. Couldn't quite make it out because my vision's not too good. Well, in case you can't see this, in that top picture is an infestation of head lice in that person's head. Now, I'm going to see how long it takes you to start scratching. It's happening right now, and as soon as you bring it up, you're like, oh. That second picture on the bottom left, you're familiar with these. I picked one of them off one of my children just the other day. A tick. And then on the bottom right, you see a leech, a blood-sucking leech. What is the gospel message in that? Where is the meaning of that? How does that affirm a belief in God? Well, let me just tell you this. Do you remember God's promise to His people when they were captive in Egypt? That He was going to deliver them from that place to the promised land? That He was going to lead them out and deliver them to a land that was flowing with milk and honey? And what happened? Moses said, oh, I'm here to take the Lord's people. And Pharaoh said, sure, take them. No. So what did he do? He sent these plagues, right? And do you remember what the plagues were? There were several of them. Water to blood, hail. One of the things that was a plague was the plague of lice. Uncomfortable, itching and scratching all the time. Itching and scratching. Why did God choose lice as a plague? Because he knew that Pharaoh and the people of Egypt would want relief, that they would want relief from that. Let's get past that. Let God's people go. Let them go. I'm tired of itching and scratching. I'm tired of itching and scratching. Let them go. Let them go. And there's the answer, perhaps. Why is it that we have things like these things that are blood-sucking, that make us so uncomfortable and even sick? Maybe it is that the reason why we have these things is so that we will not want to stay here either. And that we will want to go to a place where they are not, a promised land, so to speak, a land where there is no sickness and dying and tears. Maybe that's why they're here, is so that we won't want to stay here forever. Just an idea. Just an idea. If you look at it the right way, you see it, do you not? But then there's another one. And this is my personal favorite of them all. My grandmother, on my mother's side, was the grandparent that I had the longest. They're all gone now for me. And she was a tremendous fan of the hummingbird. She kept a feeder outside of her kitchen window. And she would stand there and watch them while she was in the kitchen, or sit by her dining room table and watch them outside the kitchen door. And if you weren't sure what to get my granny for Christmas or her birthday or any other occasion, as long as it was something related to a hummingbird, she wanted it. The little pin that goes on the lapel, if it was a hummingbird, she loved it. If it was a piece of art of some sort and it had a she loved it. If it was a sweater that had a design of a it was just the best thing. I miss my granny. I became familiar with the hummingbird because of her. They are such an amazing creature. They're such an amazing creature. Let me just give you some facts about the hummingbird. Did you know that the hummingbird, most of them weigh less than a mouthful of water? They're extremely tiny. Extremely tiny. And when they flap their wings, they are a unique bird because they are the only bird that we know of that can fly forwards, backwards, straight up, straight down, and hover. And the reason why that they're able to hover like this one is because their wings, they flap them at a pace of up to 80 times a second. Sometimes when you're watching hummingbirds, you can't even tell that they have wings because they're moving them so quickly, it's almost like they're invisible. They're an incredible creature. And because they are so tiny, and because they require so much energy when they flap their wings so fast, because they do that, they have a very interesting metabolism rate. It takes a hummingbird about 30 minutes to wake up every morning. They're incredible, incredible creatures. But here's something about the hummingbird that you may not know, and it is where the lesson is in my mind. Most people don't know that hummingbirds are a migrating bird, that they migrate. And many of the hummingbirds that we have around here come to us seasonally, many of them from Central America. They will, in many cases, migrate up to 400 to 600 miles seasonally. There are some hummingbirds, different varieties of hummingbirds that migrate even further than that. Some of them migrate as far as 1,000 miles seasonally, those little bitty birds. Well, here's the part of this that is so intriguing to me. The hummingbird, the ones that migrate here, as they come here to from Central America, they fly nonstop by themselves over about 450 miles of ocean. Of ocean. Now let me just ask you a question here, because this is the most amazing thing of it all in my judgment. This is where the hummingbird kind of sets itself apart, kind of like the ant. How does the ant know that it's going to come upon a time where it doesn't have food available because it's wintertime? How does it know that? Well, let me ask you this. How does the hummingbird know when it starts its flight across the ocean that there's even land over there? How does it know? It can't see it. It's not like some other hummingbird is flying beside it saying, "Hey, Ralph, let's keep going. It's right over here." No. It flies by itself. How does it know that? Well, I would submit for your consideration that the reason why it knows that is because it was made by God. And to some extent, I believe creatures are instinctual, and that instinct of creatures like that is a portion of faith, I guess, in that regard. How does it know? When a hummingbird sets out on this 450-mile trek across the ocean, it is nonstop flight for almost a full day. How does it even have the energy to do that? How does it even have the energy? I want to tell you something, ask you a question, and this is the question that overrides, I think, the whole theme for this evening's lesson is that if God has all power and He can do whatever He wants and He can make whatever He wants, why didn't He make the hummingbird in such a way that it doesn't have to migrate? He could if He wanted to. He could make a hummingbird that doesn't need to migrate for the seasons. He could do that. He could do that. He could make an ant that does not need food during the wintertime. He could do that. Why does He not? I tell you what I believe, and maybe you will too. God makes the creatures of this earth the way that He does for our benefit. And when you look at the hummingbird and you say, what is the lesson in that? What is the lesson in that? Well, maybe just sometimes we have to work to reach a place that we cannot see by faith. You ever thought about that? In closing, I want to submit a few things as ideas here. A few things as ideas. Could it be that every single creature on the face of the earth was deliberately created by God to help us understand and use our God-given talents? Could it be that every single creature on the face of the earth was deliberately created by God to help our belief. Could it be that every single creature on the face of the earth was deliberately created by God to encourage our longing for home? When you see it that way, maybe we understand why Job says, look at the beasts and they will tell you. Look at the fish, they will tell you. Look at the earth, it will teach you. Maybe that's why David says the heavens declare the glory of God, and it crosses all languages. Everybody can understand this if we look at it right. In closing, I want to draw your attention to a statement that's made in John, the Gospel of John, chapter 20, where it's nearing the end of the Gospel of John, and John writes, and beginning in verse 30, "And truly Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book, but these are written that you may believe that Jesus Christ, the Son of God, is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name." I believe we could stick creation in this verse and make it work. God did incredible things. Incredible things. And when he gave us the creatures of this earth and the natural things of this earth, he did it so that we might believe. And believing that we may have life in his name. So the next time that you are struggling with something, the next time that your faith is in doubt, the next time when gloom and doom surrounds us, just go outside and hear what God's creation has to say.